Should you be eating tomatoes? We're going to be talking about why some people have issues with tomatoes and other members of the nightshade family, what the benefits are, looking at both big and small studies. We're going to talk about the compounds that we find in tomatoes and why they might be beneficial. And we're going to do a little history tour as to where even tomatoes came from, as well as the best ways to choose and cook with tomatoes to get the best nutrient value out of them. This podcast kind of came out as a result of people saying, whenever I use tomatoes, I can't eat tomatoes. It worsens my gourd, or GERD as the Americans say, or it worsens my arthritis. And we're going to talk about some of the reasons as to why tomatoes can be an issue for certain people, but why they might be beneficial for others, and figure out how you can tell whether tomatoes are a good addition to your diet or not. Okay, so starting off with, we usually think of tomatoes as a vegetable. Actually, botanically, it's a fruit. It's one of the most consumed ingredients globally. Most of us eat them in one form or another on a weekly basis, whether it's in a sauce or a marinade or raw or cooked down into a delicious stew. You also get them in juices and tarts and all the rest of it. What we're going to be doing a dive into is its link to human culture, as well as its impact on our health as well. And if you are a reader of the Seasonal Sundays newsletter, you'll recognize some of the patterns that we're going to be using in today's podcast, because we do a deep dive into different ingredients every single week. You can sign up in the caption down below. It's completely for free, and people are absolutely digging it. So 3 takeaways before we even start, if you don't have time to get right to the end. The first thing is that the fruit has its origins in South and Central America, which is pretty incredible. It dates back to the ancient Mayans, thousands of years ago. Modern tomatoes are obviously very different from their wild ancestors. We've completely changed the look and feel and the nutrient profile of these ingredients. And the third thing is that they're a source of several really important nutrients: vitamin C, folate, vitamin A, potassium, as well as these bioactive compounds that we'll get into in a minute, ranging from carotenoids and flavonoids and the like as well, that are linked to health supporting effects. Okay, so let's dive into the history first. Tomatoes are now a global staple, and they're found in so many different dishes from around the world, whether it be Indian cuisine, Mediterranean cuisine, Mexican cuisine, of course. How did they become such a global staple? Well, if you step back into the landscape of South America 80,000 years ago, there was a weed-like plant with small, tiny fruits growing completely wild. And the results from some genetic studies show that this wild plant that was growing around Ecuador, most likely, is most closely related to the modern tomato as we know it today. And if you fast forward another 70,000 years to around 7,000 years ago, people around present-day Mexico, they started to domesticate these small fruits and actually form larger tomatoes. And in fact, the word tomato comes from the Aztec word tomatl, that's Tomatl. And it's still a bit of a mystery as to how this wild plant actually moved from Ecuador to Central America, but it's most likely going to be due to human movement, birds, natural migration using routes like that. At that point, tomatoes are mainly cultivated in South and Central America, and it's not until thousands of years later in the 15th and 16th centuries that you have colonists bringing domesticated tomatoes back to Europe. And it's why we find it as a central part of Spanish and Italian cuisine, because those are the guys that were using it most readily. While in France and Northern Europe, it was a little bit later. So initially, actually, the Northern Europeans thought of it as an ornamental plant that was thought to be toxic. And you know, there might be some reasons as to why some of them found it toxic, because you can imagine somebody eating a wild tomato plant and having a negative reaction when we dive into the reasons as to why there might be risks with the tomato plant and other Solanaceae family plants, the nightshades as they're otherwise known. So through the history, these tomatoes have undergone a long process of domestication, and these these fruit sizes have grown from being these tiny blueberry-sized tomatoes to cherry-sized, and obviously the very, very large buffalo-sized tomatoes that you find in Italian cuisine. And these the breeders around the world have selected plants for attractive traits like massive yield, for example, color, taste, sweetness. And that's why we find the red, scarlet, or yellow varieties more popular, but you do get green and purple varieties, and they vary in shape as well. So most of us are thinking of a tomato that's spherical shaped, but you get them oblong shaped, oval, even pear shaped ones as well, and you've got like massive varieties of those. If you've ever gone to a farmer's market, particularly in the UK now, you get heritage tomatoes and you get all these different wonderful sizes, particularly in the summer, which is why I'm releasing this podcast right now. As a result of going into certain varieties, we've had to rely on pesticides and fertilizers because this selection for high yield varieties has limited the selection of the wider tomatoes. So when you're going for more monocultures, that's where we have a reliance on pesticides because they're more prone to issues that would have protected themselves through natural diversity. So compared to the wild relatives, the relationship with soil microbes that stimulate the growth and resistance to normal pathogens has been lost, which is why I've done a podcast on pesticides and organic and the reasons as to why we have a lot more reliance on them in another podcast as well. So the tomatoes that we have today look and taste very differently from their wild ancestors, but it's incredible to know that this is one of the first plants that was domesticated for all those years and years in Central America and found its way to Europe and lots of our dishes. Health potential. So a lot of people think of tomatoes when you think of a healthy meal. You think of a salad with tomatoes and stuff. And there are lots of reasons as to why we find them healthy. And they are very healthy, in my opinion anyway. Tomatoes are a source of several important nutrients. And these include vitamin C, which you'll find in lots of different fresh fruit and vegetables, but also vitamin A, folate, potassium as well. They also contain a range of bioactive compounds, and these can be broken down into three core ones: carotenoids, flavonoids, and phenolic acids. So carotenoids, they're a major class of bioactive compounds in tomatoes, and the most common one that you've probably already heard of is lycopene. The reason why you've heard of it is probably because you've seen a headline about prostate cancer and the fact that it is due to lycopene, this carotenoid that's found in cooked tomatoes or found in higher amounts in concentrated cooked tomatoes, has been linked to prevention and even in the management of prostate cancer in its indolent form or less aggressive form. There's also gamma carotene, beta carotene, lutein that are great for your eye health, for example, that you find in tomatoes as well. Flavonoids are another class of bioactive compounds of which you find in very brightly colored ingredients like berries. They have neuroprotective and cardioprotective effects that we see in lab studies, animal studies, and in human studies as well. And you have phenolic acids, things like chlorogenic and caffeic acids, similar to what we find in coffee. And we know through those large observational data, those large observational studies, that coffee has a lot of beneficial cardiovascular benefits as well. So there might be some benefits in tomatoes as a result of those caffeic acids and other phenolic acids. Let's talk a bit about why some people have issues with tomatoes. Now, as a doctor, I've seen and see many people with arthritis, all various types of arthritis, the inflammatory joint condition of various causes. Sometimes it's autoimmune, sometimes it's degenerative, sometimes it's a result of overuse, repetitive strains. A lot of people have come to me and said, I can't eat anything from the nightshade family. And I think initially, as a doctor who didn't know much about nutrition or didn't think to do a dive into nutrition, I just kind of brushed it off as a sort of, well, it's an association that they've made up in their mind, and that's why they're having these issues. There are certainly reasons as to why people have genuine allergies to certain compounds in tomatoes, why the acidity of certain foods can be problematic for certain people as well, particularly with those who have gastroesophageal reflux disease. And that's, we say it differently to the Americans. In America, you guys call the esophagus with an E, so it's GERD, whereas we call it with an O-E, which is gourd. And there are reasons as to why acidic foods can be problematic for people with gourd or GERD. And then there are some compounds that can exacerbate arthritis as well. And there are a bunch of other associations with other conditions that I'll briefly touch on. So allergies, why might someone have an allergy to tomatoes? So you can have an allergy to many different ingredients. The common ones that most people are aware of are nut allergies, shellfish, egg, etc. There are 8 common allergies that most people are aware of. There are certain compounds in tomatoes that have been found, certain proteins that have the ability to trigger an allergic response. So if you find yourself consuming a tomato, it could be as a result of a number of different proteins, one of which is a glycosylated tomato protein, also something that I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of, is beta-fructofuranosidenase. There's also profiling and a whole bunch of other of these proteins. You don't need to know the name of them because you're not going to be tested for them. But the allergic response that you'd probably be very privy to is when you consume tomatoes, either in a raw or cooked form, you might get symptoms such as skin flaring, wheezing, flushing, and that's a result of histamine release that's causing that allergic reaction. So most people who understand and acknowledge that they have an allergy to tomatoes have these symptoms, and it's quite easy to spot. Sometimes it might be a little bit more subtle, and sometimes it might also depend on the type of tomato that you're consuming as well, whether it's cooked or raw, and even the actual type of tomato, because within different colored tomatoes, as we'll get into later, there are different amounts of these different proteins. So a green tomato or a smaller cherry tomato might not be as problematic as certain other larger tomatoes or different varieties. And there is a connection there as well with migraines. So that's allergies to tomatoes. Acidity. So tomatoes are technically classed as an acidic food. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to change your blood pH. It's not going to change your urinary pH. But there are certain organic acids, prominent organic acids that you find in tomatoes. And the 2 most prominent ones are citric and malic acids. And patients with typically severe gastrointestinal disease, such as reflux, when you have quite significant reflux, they can be recommended to reduce the consumption of acidic foods, including tomatoes and tomato products, along with other sort of lifestyle advice. And we will do a podcast on gourd because it's certainly something that I think has more of a relationship with other types of foods that we consume, namely sugar, processed foods, deep fried foods that are quite heavy, and other inflammatory foods as well. This, I think, is quite it is more on the side of anecdote. So when people are suffering with gourd, I think there's more things that you can do in the initial circumstances than removing tomatoes completely from your diet is the first call. So getting on top of sugar, getting on top of weight, getting on top of other things that could be irritating the esophageal lining is probably more pragmatic than removing tomatoes from your diet, as they have health benefits, as we'll talk about a little bit later. But if you've done all those things and you still have symptoms, or you feel that your gourd could be better managed, then removing tomatoes might be an additional strategy to entertain as well. There was a 2014 population-based study published in the BMC that found no association between tomato products and the severity or frequency of gourd. So again, there's conflicting evidence on this, just to state that this isn't a blanket rule, and you've really got to individualize your diet and what you want to try to improve symptoms to your own response to it. Okay, so that's acidity, arthritis. So within tomatoes, this is going to sound scary, and it shouldn't be, but there are something called glycoalkaloids. Tomatine is one of the prominent ones, and solanine as well. And you get these not just in raw tomatoes, but also in derived tomato products as well. Tomatine is mildly toxic, and it's found not just in tomatoes, as you'd imagine tomatine to be found in tomatoes. You find it in aubergine, or as the Americans call it, eggplant. You find it in potato and tobacco, basically nightshade family plants. And the other word that you'll find associated with nightshade is a bit more colloquial. Solanaceae, I might be pronouncing that incorrectly as well, but Solanaceae family of ingredients have these mildly toxic glycoalkaloids. These can be irritant to people with arthritis, and it can be for lots of different types of arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, osteoarthritis. So again, if you do have symptoms and you feel that you might be triggered by certain ingredients in your diet, it might be worth trialing removing all Solanaceae or nightshade-based plants from your diet and then monitoring symptoms. I think doing these little personal experiments is the best strategy that anyone can do. So doing a rigorous symptom diary 2 weeks before any intervention, so you understand what your baseline is, and then doing the intervention. In this case, it would be removal of certain ingredients, ensuring that everything else stays the same, essentially, which is very hard to do in nutrition, and then monitoring those symptoms as a result of your intervention. And then if you find a benefit, it's hard to discount the placebo, but, let's say there is a significant benefit, then that might be something that you want to explore as a strategy going forward. There are other issues, but I think these are probably lesser so with tomatoes. So there are case reports of issues with IBS, and that might be due to the seeds of tomatoes that can be irritant to certain people with IBS. Again, IBS is a big umbrella term. It can mean a whole bunch of different things. It can be caused by a number of different issues as well. So it's very hard to say tomatoes, IBS, remove them and you feel better. It's very hard to say that. But again, personal experiments, something that you might want to consider as well. So the answer, the question that I always get is, should you avoid tomatoes? And in my personal opinion, yes, they are a member of the nightshade family, the Solanaceae family that include all those other ingredients. And I think you should exercise caution when consuming those plants if you do have an established condition like arthritis or GORD. But generally, I think there's little evidence that nightshades are harmful. And actually, each person's tolerances are unique. And I think our health effects or our tolerance effects are always in flux, discounting those with genuine allergies. I think as a result of improving our microbiota, improving our baseline state of inflammation, these can all have a more tolerant effect of certain ingredients in your diet. So there might be certain people who can't tolerate tomatoes today, but at some point in the future, they might be able to better tolerate them because they've made changes to their lifestyle, their diet, etc., etc. The bottom line is that you've got to focus on what works for you and doing those little personal experiments and diversifying actually what we tend to eat. Because if we're just eating tomatoes or if we're just eating brassica vegetables, of course, you're lacking that diversity. You're probably going to be exposing yourself to high amounts of a certain ingredient that can lead to issues as well. In terms of overall health, if we're looking at those less reliable but like larger studies, typically epidemiological studies or observational studies, they are linked to beneficial effects. And whether that's because tomato eaters or regular tomato eaters tend to be healthful people, tend to be those who also consume a variety of other ingredients and take better care of themselves, it's hard to disentangle. But I think, in terms of long-term health and disease prevention, there are a number of studies that demonstrate the inclusion of tomatoes is certainly something beneficial. So clinical trials looking at the effects of tomatoes in human health. There was an umbrella review published in Food Chemistry in 2021, and this combined data from multiple meta-analyses and 20 health outcomes to provide a real large overall sort of eagle-eye view of the evidence. And the authors actually concluded that the intake of tomatoes was A, generally safe, and B, beneficial for multiple health outcomes, including all-cause mortality, i.e. if you have tomatoes, you're less likely to die than someone who isn't consuming tomatoes. Coronary heart disease, so cardiovascular health, cerebrovascular disease, prostate cancer, and gastric cancer. So including tomatoes in your diet because of all those nutrients that we already talked about, with the anti-inflammatory effects, with the anti-cancer effects, with the promotion of cardiovascular effects, is likely going to have a positive effect on your health. There are smaller studies that look at the protective effects of tomatoes, specifically looking at dietary lycopene. Dietary lycopene is like the darling of all tomato studies, and they suggest benefits on metabolic syndrome and male infertility. And recently there was evidence that the consumption of lycopene or lycopene-rich products that we'll get to in a second, because a lycopene-rich product would be a cooked tomato product that is concentrated in something like a puree or a triple concentrated puree, may reduce the impact of ultraviolet radiation on skin. That isn't to say that if you have a tub of puree, then you don't need to wear your sun cream, but there might be what we call a photoprotective effect on skin from having high amounts of lycopene in your diet as well. There are some other bioactive compounds from the carotenoid family of phytonutrients that can also have photoprotective effects, but it's not enough to put your sunscreen to one side. And I always recommend going for a natural sunscreen as well. So one that doesn't have a cocktail milieu of all these unnecessary preservatives and additives that might actually have a net negative effect on your health. I would always go for a good quality natural sun blocker when you're getting exposures to high amounts of sun, although in the UK we don't seem to be having that. The research that looked at the studies that I mentioned earlier, there are, again, just to caveat everything, there are issues with these studies. There's heterogeneity in the way the studies were conducted. We also have no idea about the varieties of those tomatoes that I talked about. So when people talk about tomatoes, they're just lumping it into one big thing. But as you know from listening to the collection of different nutrients, there are going to be variations depending on how wild a tomato it was, what kind of heritage tomato it is, how that tomato was grown. That can affect the lycopene content, the ripening effect, the color of the tomato. Is it green, yellow, red, etc.? So it's very hard to determine exactly what the health benefits would be if we were just looking at one particular tomato, because in reality it's too hard to do. There's so many nuances. Let's talk a bit about why tomatoes look or taste a certain way. There's, like I said, there's green, there's yellow, there's red tomatoes. The color of tomatoes is produced by combinations of different types of pigments, including carotenoids and chlorophyll, the main ones. So carotenoids are the ones that give the yellow, the red coloring, all those different sort of mixtures, and the chlorophyll is going to give the green. So there are several genes that regulate the fruit color and the pigment color. In tomatoes, like I said, red tomatoes, lycopene is the main carotenoid present, while yellow and green fruited varieties tend to have little or no lycopene, which again, going back to what I said earlier about the impact of lycopene and the broader big studies, how much you can ascertain from the lycopene content versus the content of all these other compounds that you find in different tomatoes. Very, very hard to draw that association, which is why I'm not a fan of arbitrarily having lycopene supplements or just looking at one particular bioactive compound. It's likely going to be that combination that has that synergistic effect on health promotion than the inclusion of a singular nutrient, no matter how sexy it sounds and how successful it is in a rat study. And during the ripening phase of tomatoes, there is change in color. So typically, if you think of a traditional quote unquote tomato, it will go from green to red. And the reason why is because you get accumulation of those carotenoids in the skin in response to light during that ripening process. So not only are these carotenoids giving the color, they're also giving flavor as well. So carotenoids don't have taste, but by controlling the pigments that also control the color of tomatoes, you can actually have an impact on determining the aroma and the flavor of your tomato as well. And that's because there's an accumulation of a whole bunch of flavor related compounds like sugars, which can affect the taste and aroma of it. And you also get these VOCs, also known as volatile organic compounds. And today, the tomatoes that we taste is really a balance of all those different contributions from sugars, volatile organic compounds, and acids as well that you find. So next time you smell a tomato or you taste a tomato, just think about all those different compounds that you're consuming in different amounts. And that's why, some will taste like completely insipid and floury, like a lot of my European friends who come over to the UK and they taste a tomato for the first time from a regular supermarket. But then you get a heritage tomato or something that you might find in season, like right now from a farmer's market, and you'll be able to taste something completely different, sometimes acidic, sometimes sweet. Look at the color of it, look at the differences in the color profile. It really does have an impact on the experience of consuming that tomato as well. I want to talk about something that I'm super excited about, which is food combinations. I don't think there's enough talked about when it comes to food combinations. And food combinations can have a demonstrable impact, a significant impact on the nutrients that you can absorb from your food. It's not just about like the cooking time or minimally processing, which obviously I agree with, and I think that's very important, but also the combination of different ingredients that can heighten the nutrients that you consume. So lycopene, just to focus on lycopene for this example, lycopene is better absorbed when tomatoes are cooked with specific ingredients. And when I think of tomatoes and cooking, I think of a wonderful sort of combination of onions, shallot, garlic, peppers. I think of making a sofrito. I think of making a curry base with ginger, garlic, mustard oil, all those different sort of combinations. Well, it turns out that particularly with olive oil, onions, garlic, leek, brassica vegetables, so your cauliflower, broccoli, rocket, and shiitake mushrooms, they contain compounds such as the fats in those compounds like you'd find in olive oil, for example, or sulfurous compounds that can modify the chemical structure of lycopene that makes it easier for our bodies to absorb. So when you combine these in a thermal mixture and you cook them together, so this is a degree of natural processing, if you like, when you're doing a little chemistry experiment every time you sit down to make a risotto or whatever it might be, or a stew, but when you're combining those ingredients, you're actually making the lycopene a lot more accessible, a lot more available. So a traditional dish like a sofrito or a gazpacho, they're not just incredible for the flavor benefits, but they also have incredible and higher health benefits as a result of you being able to absorb better those ingredients. And this is taken from a paper called Enhanced Z Isomerization of Tomato Lycopene through the Optimal Combination of Food Ingredients. So just to give some clarity as to what Z isomerization is, most lycopene is in an E configuration, which is a different sort of structure compared to Z. And Z appears to be more bioavailable in terms of how we're able to absorb that lycopene. And those ingredients that I just mentioned, the shiitake mushroom, garlic, onion, brassica vegetables, extra virgin olive oil. I'm adding the extra virgin olive oil because I promote extra virgin olive oil rather than just olive oil, but olive oil seems to be the one that they used. This promotes thermal Z isomerization of lycopene, which makes it a lot more bioavailable. So pretty incredible. I love coming across gems of information like that will not only get you cooking a lot more and also thinking about the little chemistry experiments that you're doing in your own kitchen, but also like how exciting that a traditional dish like a sofrito, the start of a traditional dish, is actually healthful as well. The other thing to think about, processed versus fresh tomatoes. So which is better, are there differences? So more processed tomato products than raw tomatoes are actually consumed in the Western world, so United States and likely the UK as well. And in the UK, 46% of tomatoes are sold as fresh, whilst the rest are sold as canned. So there is definitely more processed tomato products out there. You'll find them in things like sauces and ketchups and paste and that kind of stuff. Preservation or processing can mean a plethora of different things. It's not all takeaways and found on pizzas and curries that are like made in batches and frozen, for example. Process can also mean frozen, jarred, cans, and these are generally pretty nutritious. You're minimally processing them. And there is data that suggests that different processing methods have different effects on those compounds that you find in tomatoes. So there isn't a simple yes or no answer as to, okay, if I have processed tomatoes, that's not good for me. If I have raw tomatoes or if I cook them in my own kitchen, that's going to be better for me. Generally, I think tomatoes that are jarred or canned are pretty good. And if that's a convenient way of getting tomatoes and all those wonderful beneficial compounds, as long as you're not allergic to them or the other things that we talked about earlier, that's a great way to add it into your diet. The things that I would be wary of are when you look at the back of a product and you see added sugar, sodium chloride, you add ingredients that are not typically found in a household kitchen. That's when you're moving from the processed or the ultra processed classification from 1 to 4. So just as an aside, we have the Nova classification, of which there are 4 groups. Group 1 is unprocessed or minimally processed food. So that's basically a raw tomato in this case. And then the further you move into the groups, you get to number 4, which is ultra processed. So a typical ultra processed tomato based product might be a takeaway curry where there's loads of tomatoes in it, but it's also got preservatives, additives, stabilizers, gums, everything to homogenize it. That's where you get an ultra processed food. Group 2 is processed culinary ingredients. So you could argue that would be a jarred tomato with maybe a little bit of salt in it. And that for me will still have plenty of benefits in. So I don't think we always need to be opting for raw at every step of the way. So we have a better understanding of tomatoes in all their glory. I want to bring this back to information that you can take to your shop and to your kitchen. So my top tips for choosing and cooking for flavor with tomatoes, they're an ingredient to master for sure, right? For nutrition and flavor. I hope by the end of this pod, you will be excited about tomatoes as much as I am. They're super versatile. And when you look at the flavor profile of tomatoes, depending on what you do to them, they're pretty unique because you can exert and extract different flavors all the way from sweet and fruity to umami and meaty. You can definitely get the umami out of tomatoes by cooking them, by searing them. If you have if you think of a typical fry up, an English fry up, that grilled tomato with the charring on it has got an umami flavor. It should taste salty. depending on where you get your tomato from, if the tomato tastes flowery, then you're not going to get that. But from a real tomato that's got sweet sugars in it, you can get that Maillard reaction when you grill it, and that will give out the umami flavor. You'll definitely be able to get that, extract that. So when you're shopping for tomatoes, you want to look for tomatoes are grown all year round for starters, and I think the highest quality tomatoes are obviously going to be those in season, and you will be able to taste the difference. No matter what sort of stage you are on your culinary journey, you'll be able to taste the difference between a flowery, forced grown tomato versus an in-season tomato. The in-season tomato is going to taste a lot sweeter, a lot fresher. You're going to be able to taste a lot more complexity in it. The out-of-season forced tomato is going to taste like flour, and actually the texture of it is going to be a lot more sludgy as well. It's not going to have as much bite. They're typically quite hard to chop as well. Make the most of fresh tomatoes when they're in season. They tend to grow in the warmer months of spring, summer, early autumn. So right now, great. And during the cooler months, so when you're in the winter, for example, you can enjoy the jarred versions or the canned version or dried. And you can even make those yourself if you have time as well. A question I'm asked a lot is, if your tomatoes are coming from the UK, when should you be looking for them? It's around June to mid-September. And we can get good quality tomatoes grown in the UK. There are some air mile benefits there as well, but we tend to have some good quality tomatoes. However, if they're grown in like locally heated greenhouses, this is where buying local might not necessarily be ideal. And you might want to look for, imported tomatoes from Europe, from Spain, for example, that actually might have a better environmental impact, and it might have a better flavor impact as well. On the further flip side, so this is where it gets very complicated when choosing and buying any ingredient. Really, you could have these sort of back and forth with lots of different trade-offs, and everything is a trade-off. That's something you have to be aware of. Spain, as an example, is the European leader in terms of pesticide sales. So you could argue that tomatoes tend to have a lot more pesticides sprayed on them in certain European farms. So you might want to opt for organic. They tend to be picked less ripe in Europe because they've obviously got some traveling to do. So when they arrive on the supermarket shelves, they will naturally ripen that way. Whereas British tomatoes are vined ripened because there's less of a delivery challenge. And there's also polytunnel British tomatoes as well, which I think are great, and we can get some really good ones there as well. I would probably opt for smaller producers if possible, but again, this gets into like a privileged conversation where those who can afford the best tomatoes can obviously choose to buy from smaller producers who are transparent about their produce, but it's not accessible to everyone due to cost. We also had in the UK a tomato shortage this year due to lower than average temperatures in Spain and Morocco, and so large suppliers of salad veg in the UK were struggling, and buying from small suppliers means that you're getting more information about the availability rather than this sort of illusion of all year round abundance, and you can adapt a bit more. You can adapt a little bit better to what's available in season, but I guess that comes down to culinary skill as well. The organic question, I sort of alluded to this earlier. So tomatoes might be one of those ingredients worth buying organic if you can. We did a podcast on organic produce recently. They appeared on the 2019 list of fruit and vegetables most likely to contain more than one pesticide in the UK. And in a study carried out in 2016 in Spain, tomatoes showed the highest percent of pesticide residue. More data should come out in the following year, as tomatoes are part of the listed ingredients that we test for 2023. And if you want more information on that, there's the organic podcast that I've done that will be available on YouTube as well, with the lists that have the most common ingredients with a mixture of pesticides, as well as the highest amount of pesticides as well, which are not necessarily the same thing. which tomato is beneficial, that has the best benefit, it's impossible for me to even answer that question as to whether you should go for a Roma tomato, a heritage tomato, a certain type of buffalo tomato. You know, cherry tomatoes are great for snacking. We're always snacking on those in my household. Classic tomatoes are really good for stewing and cooking down. If you get a tomato and you don't like the flavor of it, or it doesn't taste like it has any flavor whatsoever, that's a perfect stewing tomato. So don't throw those away, because you can concentrate whatever nutrition there is by stewing it down in a pan with some other ingredients. Again, packing with onions, olive oil, leeks, and extra and those extra fats to absorb a lot more of those nutrients. For whatever nutrients you're finding there, you're going to get a lot more from that combination of food ingredients as well. So that's definitely a good hack for getting the most out of whatever you can afford. I mean, they're great for barbecuing as well. If we can get a barbecue in this year, that'd be epic. So look, my culinary pairings for tomatoes, obviously they go really well with basil and cucumber, but anchovies, anything that's really salty and umami, I think tomatoes are a really good pairing. Aubergine, again, another nightshade family, but again, really, really good in terms of the combination. Grilling with courgette or zucchini, as the people in the States would say, oregano, and even watermelon. Watermelon, tomato, bit of feta cheese, bit of extra virgin olive oil, salt. That's all you need to make an incredible, incredible side salad. So yeah, try them mixed with feta chili, pickled red onion, for example, fresh mint, lemony dressing. That's one way I would do it. And then go for a gazpacho as well. And just know that when you're combining it in a gazpacho, which is, you know, cucumber, pepper, extra virgin olive oil, red wine vinegar, onion, blended up, add a little bit of cold or ice water to just thin it out a little bit as a cold summer soup. It's a wonderful, wonderful dish. And you can make it your own. You can change the acidity, you can change the salt just by adding a few of those extra ingredients to make it your own. So look, that's a deep dive into tomatoes. We're going to be doing other ingredients as well. Remember that certain people have issues with tomatoes. It's understandable if you think about the allergic potential of certain proteins that you find in tomatoes. It's understandable because you do have some acids in tomatoes, malic and citric acid, that can be in high amounts, that can irritate some people's gourd. And you also have some alkaloids that can irritate people's arthritis as well. If you don't fall into that camp, I think Solanaceae family ingredients like eggplant, tomatoes actually do have health benefits, looking at the wider studies and those smaller studies as well. And there are a variety of ways in which you can get all the nutrient compounds from tomatoes in a better way by combining it with some of those food ingredients as well as good quality fats as well. If you like that video, then you will love the full library from the Doctor's Kitchen podcast. We talk about inflammation, immune health benefits, and much, much more about food as medicine, including this video right here that you can click through right now.